i gospodo, poštovani matičari, danas imamo jedno zaista veliko zadovoljstvo da u organizaciji Centra za društveno i političko istraživanje Republike Srpske i Matice Srpske pozdravimo profesora doktora Davida Engelsa, profesora Katoličkog univerziteta u Vendeji, koji će nam držati predavanje pod naslovom Stanje evropske civilizacije, hesperiјalizam i geopolitika. Mi ćemo, osim predavanja, čuti ovde takođe i gospodina Dušana Pavlovića, koji je direktor Centra za društveno i političko istraživanje Republike Srpske. Hvala i za ovaj oblik saradnje, a mislim da ćemo mi nastaviti dalje da radimo korist iste stvari. I tu je naš doktor Miša Đurković, koji, kao što znate, ima projekat u Matici Srpskoj i godinama sarađujemo. Lep model saradnje smo ostvarili dok je Miša Đurković vodio Institut za evropske studije i sad to nastavljamo na svoj način. Upravo u okviru te saradnje smo uspostavili saradnju sa Špenglerovom asocijacijom. Jedan od osnivača Špenglerovog društva jeste upravo profesor dr. David Engels. Mi smo pre 2 godine u Skupštini Matice Srpske odlučili da, na predlog upravo dr. Miša Đurkovića, da profesora dr. Davida Engelsa primimo za počasnog člana Matice Srpske. I ja uz, dakle, sada ovo naknadno čestitanje gospodina Engelsu za to počasno članstvo, želim da mu predam i plaketu koju je Matica Srpska izradila povodom 200. godišnjice letopisa Matice Srpske. S obzirom da su ideje konzervativizma i tradicionalizma u svekolikom mišljenju u sudbini Evrope i raznih naroda unutar Evrope, jedna od obsesivnih tema upravo profesora dr. Davida Engelsa, koji izučava i antički period evropske istorije, pa do naših doba, onda će ovih 200 godina Matice Srpske njemu svakako nešto značiti. Dear Professor Engels, you know that you are a honorary member of Matica Srpska.
Absolutely.
Yes. Matica Srpska Assembly had chosen you 2 years ago for that honorary member. And I'm really happy because I can give you this plaque. We have made it for 200 years old our literary scientific journal, Letopis Matice Srpske. It has been founded in 1824, and it has been continuously publishing up to these days. So, according to our knowledge, there is just one literary scientific journal in the world which has better continuity in its life, we can say. This is the Yale Review. This is a literary scientific journal which was founded in New Haven, in Connecticut, and after several decades it became under the protection of Yale University. So, Letopis Matice Srpske has a protection of Matica Srpska, and I want to give you that to remember of our Society of Matica Srpska and about Letopis Matice Srpske. This is a present for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor also to be an honorary member of your association. So when I learned the content, when we prepared that some time ago, we felt extremely honored by that being even now an external member to this association. So this will be a magnificent reminder, even more so as I have a very particular relationship to the symbol of the bee, as I edited even the book on the bee. So this makes it even more precious to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming here. We're really great. That's a pleasure, great pleasure for us to listen about your thesis about development of European cultures and problems in our days. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dame i gospodo, sad bih dao reč dr. Dušanu Pavloviću, direktoru Centra za društvene političke istraživanja Republike Srpske. Njegova je inicijativa društva jeste, odnosno instituta, naravno sve preko Miše Živkovića, on je dragoceni izvodnik te energije, ali ovih institucionalne saradnje koje se ulazi je zahvaljujući upravo ono što je došlo i od vas. Pa vas molim da i vi pozdravite našeg dragog gosta.
Hvala vam, profesore Staniću. Zaista je čast, velika čast biti u jednoj od najeminentnijih, najznačajnijih ustanova institucija srpskog naroda uopšte. Nama je veliko zadovoljstvo da smo nakon čast, opet kažem, nakon Banja Luke, mi smo prošle godine dovodili profesora Engelsa na nekoliko dana, povodom promocije prevoda njegove knjige Braniti evropsku civilizaciju. Radili smo promociju u Banja Luci plus nekoliko predavanja. Sada smo evo u prilici, zahvaljujući dobrim domaćinima u Matici srpskoj, kao i profesoru Miši Đurkoviću, da budemo ovde zajedno, da čujemo profesora Engelsa i danas. Što se tiče centra, naravno nismo, da kažem samo nekoliko riječi, pošto smo i mlada institucija, osnovani smo prije neke 3-4 godine. Centar je osnovala Vlada Republike Srpske pri Ministarstvu nauke i visokog obrazovanja. Mi smo vezani sudbonosno za Republiku Srpsku kao takvu i bavimo se strateškim politikama Republike Srpske, njenim unutrašnjim položajem, statusom unutar Dejtonske Bosne i Hercegovine, ugovore Dejtonske Bosne i Hercegovine i naravno na međunarodnom planu, a na osnovu međunarodnog prava i poredka uopšte strukture koja je danas bar još uvijek u svijetu. Što se tiče profesora Engelsa, on je mnogo rekao za sebe i nema potrebe nešto da ga posebno predstavljamo, ali malo prije sam ispomenuo ono što je Spengler pokušavao da da kao neku vrstu dijagnoze zašto zapadna Evropa prvenstveno opada. Naš dragi profesor David Engels pokušava da negdje pomogne da se da nekakva terapija za tu dijagnozu i on to zaista iskreno radi svim svojim bićem i svoj život posvetio tome. Nama je bilo zanimljivo nakon boravka u Banjoj Luci kako vidi sad Srbe u tom konceptu Evrope kakvu i on pokušava da zastupa. I tu smo otprilike imali priliku da razumijemo nakon njegovog boravka u Banjoj Luci, radili smo sa njim jedan intervju u časopisu koji smo isto radili, Centar se zove, imamo jedan značajan intervju i ovu knjigu i Centar i časopis ćemo imati ovdje par primjera kad smo donijeli za vas. Tako da oni koji su zainteresovani moći malo bliže da se upoznaju sa misli i mišlju profesora Engelsa. Toliko od mene, ne više da vam uzmem vrijeme. Hvala vam mnogo na pažnji i tu smo idemo da čujemo one koje smo ovdje. Hvala vam.
Hvala vam lepo. A sad dajem reč spiritus movesu svih ovih interesovanja koje su se asocirale pre svega oko Instituta za evropske studije i oko njegovog ličnog istraživanja, a to je dr. Mišo Đurković. Mišo, on te predstavi i gosta i pozdravi.
Poštovani predsjedniče, dragi Dušane, šef David, poštovani prijatelji, pomože Bog pred svega. Dakle, stvarno je veliko zadovoljstvo da evo, na neki način završavamo sa predstavljanjem osnivača Špenglerovog društva i ako se ništa ponosan i srećan, to je što smo uspeli da organizujemo da dođe profesor Max Otte, koga smo imali prilike čujemo, zatim Gerd Morgenthaler, koji je umeđu vremenu takođe postao počasni član Matice, isto je vrlo bitno simbolički da se podsjetimo, čovjek pripada nemačkoj porodici koja je 150 godina živjela na ovim prostorima i strašno mu je bitno bilo da obnovi te kontakte i tako dalje. I evo, konačno, dugo smo pričali, to i planirali, uspeli smo, zahvaljujući Dušanu, pre svega da kažem u nekom logističkom i organizacionom smislu, da konačno realizujemo posetu profesora Engelsa Matici, dakle, Novom Sadu danas, i sutra u Beogradu, dakle, sutra ćemo raditi klasično predstavljanje knjige gde će govoriti gospodin Pavlović, ja i David Engels. Dozvolite mi malo da, što kaže, kad govorimo o radu Matice, tu je i kolega Gajić, dakle, mi vodimo u Matici prvi politikološki projekat, i to je stvarno jedna velika čast, koji 4 godine imamo jedan lep tim gde smo Saša, ja, Nebojša Vuković i još par mlađih kolega, i koji je posvećen ideji Srbiji u aktualnim međunarodnim odnosima. Upravo ovo, da vidimo gde smo i politikološki i geopolitički, ali i vrednosno i kulturološki. I s te strane strašno je bitno što je David danas sa nama. I dozvolite mi, pre nego što ga predstavim, jednu rečenicu o veoma važnom radu koji Centar za društvene i političke istraživanja radi. To je jedna plemenita i lepa ideja, recimo koliko, 3-4 godine već ima kako funkcioniše, koju su neki ljudi u vrhu Republike Srpske prepoznali kao strašno bitan zadatak, da neko prati i strateški osmišljava i određene politike, ali i reaguje akademski i strateški na određene probleme koji se pojavljaju. Ja sam stvarno imao zadovoljstvo da, recimo, učestvujem u jednom odličnom programu koje su kolege organizovale o problemu mentalnog zdravlja u Republici Srpskoj, gde je mentalno zdravlje shvaćeno vrlo široko, dakle, od pitanja kladionica, dakle, i zavisnosti ljudi tamo, do položaja porodice, transgenderizma koji se gura i tako dalje i tako dalje. I u tom smislu mi je strašno drago da nastavljamo saradnju. I još jedno ime koje, nažalost, nije danas i sutra sa nama, ali jako bitno, to je Filip Gašpar, dakle, jedan ozbiljan Hercegovac, dakle, iz zapadne Hercegovine, poreklom, rođen u Nemačkoj, koji puno radi i puno nam pomaže, uključujući, što bi rekli, iniciranje, objavljivanje ove knjige i još neke drugih projekata koje je realizovao sa Dušanom, i prosto volio bih da ga pozdravim kao neko ko je doprinao čitavoj ovoj priči. Sad, da ne bih dužio, dakle, imam to zadovoljstvo da Davida znam, recimo, nekih 12 godina već, preko jedne ozbiljne sekte, da kažem, kako volimo da se šalimo, koja se zove Banenburg. Dakle, Banenburg je jedna najozbiljniji klub konzervativnih intelektualaca koji danas postoji, gde se jednom godišnje, dakle, sreće jedna ozbiljna ekipa ljudi, uglavnom iz Evrope, ali dolaze i ljudi iz Amerike, iz Latinske Amerike, Australije i tako dalje. I već nekih 12 godina imam to zadovoljstvo da mogu da srećem te ljude i da sarađujem sa njima. I sa Davidom zaista već 10 godina sam imao to zadovoljstvo da pričam o raznim stvarima i da vidim jednu ogromnu širinu, zaista renesansno poznavanje koje on ima. I deo toga ćete vidjeti u ovoj knjizi koja je negde programski rađena i zaista bi vam preporučio maksimalno da je pročitate. To je 100-ak strana velikog formata, da kažem, kod nas, ali vrlo na neki način sažetak onoga što on radi svih ovih godina. On je čovjek klasičan katolički mislilac, kako sebe vidi, neko duboko privržen ideji hesperiјalizma, odnosno zapada u nekom širem smislu i te tradicije, čovjek koji insistira na klasičnim pojmovima, kako on to voli da kaže, transcendencije, znači božanskog principa kao osnovnog za zapadnog čovjeka u nekom širem smislu, lepote, dakle, bez ikakvih relativizacija i istine. Dakle, to su oni neki klasični modeli i vrednosti koji su danas najviše na udaru, a koje on upravo zbog toga nastoji da brani. On je završio pre svega istoričar, ali način na koji on shvata istoriju je zaista filozofski, geopolitički često, vrednosni, možemo reći teološki u nekom širem smislu i tako dalje. Čovjek neverovatnog obrazovanja zaista, I neko ko je, ajde da kažem, u ovom osnovnom smislu doktorirao 2008. godine u Aachenu u Nemačkoj uglavnom i njegovo poreklo i po imenu i tako dalje, on je zaista jedan evropski čovjek koji obuhvata i Belgiju i Nemačku i Francusku gde sada predaje i neko ko je 7 godina proveo u Poljskoj, dakle na institutu za hodnik, s jednim vrlo zanimljivim iskustvom gde mi kaže da 3 njegova sina danas, iako se vratili 5 godina u Belgiju, u kući između sebe uglavnom komuniciraju na poljskom, da sa njim pričaju na nemačkom, a sa mamom na francuskom i tako dalje. I'm speaking about the language, you can follow it. So, tako da je to isto jedna širina, dobi jedno fantastično poznavanje slovenske kulture i tako dalje, a moram da kažem da među brojnim radovima koji je uradio, to možete sve naći na njegovom sajtu, recimo knjige, zbornici, časopisi, to je sada već jedna bibliografija koja mislim da ide sa prevodima na preko 30-ak različitih nivoa, jer recimo knjige poput recimo Renovacija Europa ili Obnova Evrope, kako bismo mi rekli, koja se pojavila 2019. godine, u međuvremenu je, ja da znam, prevedena bar na 5 do 6 jezika. Uglavnom su njegove knjige, kao što je recimo Pad ili Opadanje iz 2013. ili Deklan, prevedeni i popravili na italijanski, na španski, francuski, naravno, nemački, čak ima 2 knjige prevedene na bugarski jezik, dakle, što je vrlo zanimljivo. Ova knjiga je doživjela, I think, almost 10 different editions and translations for the time. Prevedena je u bugarskoj, Hrvati imaju svoje izdanje, dakle, na ove svetske jezike i tako dalje. Ono što je u fokusu njegovih istraživanja, naravno, moram da pomenem, to je jako bitno, bavi se i starim Rimom, na tome je doktorirao, ima sjajnu knjigu koja pravi paralele između Rima, opadanja Rima u doba i pokušaja obnove u doba Augustina i sadašnjeg stanja Evrope, nešto slično što je naš kolega Saša Gajić radio praveći paralelu između Amerike i Rima. Dakle, onda ima sjajnu knjigu o, kao što sam rekao, o pokušajima obnove Evrope, ima knjigu o Iranu i iranskim dinastijama, dakle njihovom iskustvu i na neki način pravi tu jednu široku paralelu između razvoja, na neki način špenderijansko razmišljanje, kako razne civilizacije prolaze kroz iste faze, uključujući razvoj i opadanje, i ono što ga posebno zanima, o čemu će i danas govoriti, jeste kako neka civilizacija u svom odmaklom dobu, kada se očigledno nalazi u procesu opadanja, što se dešava sa zapadnom civilizacijom, može da se relativno obnovi kroz jednu sintezu i da produži kvalitetan život sebi kroz još neko vreme. Mogu bi 3 dana da pričam zaista o njemu, čovjek koji je dobio recimo i nagradu u Poljskoj, dakle zlatnu medalju Leha Kačinskog i razna druga priznanja. Mnogi od ovih njegovih ideja i knjiga su izuzetno razmatrane na brojnim seminarima i tako dalje. I da završim, kako sam i počeo sa pričom o Špenglerovom društvu, on je jedan od ljudi koji je uz Maxa Otea i Bjarna Morgenthalera obnovio rad i sad je to već skoro 10-ak godina, dakle, kontinuiranog rada sa dodelom nagrada na svake 2 godine, recimo, nagradu su dobili Michel Houellebecq i razni drugi ozbiljni savremeni intelektualci, ali što je još važnije, organizuju seminare, objavljuju ozbiljne knjige i časopise povodom Špenglera i na 2 godine organizuju ozbiljnu konferenciju o različitim aspektima Špenglerove misli, gde je po pravilu David uz Maxa uređuje taj izdanje. To su stvarno vrlo vredni časopisi i knjige. Ne bih dužio više, dakle, zamolit ćemo ga da izloži ovo svoje osnovno predavanje, nakon čega ćemo moći da imamo diskusiju s njim uz prevod i tako dalje. Thank you very much and please the floor is yours.
Yeah, so first, thank you very much for this kind invitation to Serbia. So it's, as I already said, really a pleasure and an honor also to be an honorary member of this very honorable and time-honored institution. So it's even better now to see also with my own eyes, of course, Matica, srpska, and to really have an idea about all the richness of the past that is behind this institution. So it's really a great pleasure to have the opportunity of presenting some of my thoughts on European civilization, on hesperiјализam and on geopolitics. So a lot of elements that can also be found in the book that has now been recently translated into Serbian, and that would give you a better overview.
Just small translation.
Okay.
Gospodin Engels se zahvalio i na pozivu i na mogućnosti da konačno direktno uživo vidi Maticu, da osjeti tu snagu tradicije, dakle, o kojoj ovde govorimo i koju naravno on deli, i zahvalio se naravno na medalji koju je dobio i kaže da je vidio i prepoznao naravno ideje koje i on pokušava da odbrani, razvije i predstavi kroz ovu knjigu i predavanje koje će danas održati.
But yeah, so without any further ado, and not in order to make you work even longer, I will start with the presentation itself. And I think you have the Serbian translation right over there on the screen, I hope more or less visible. So, there was a time when Europe was not only a continent, but an idea. The political heart of the world, the forge of truth, beauty and power. Its cities radiated faith and knowledge, its armies set the boundaries of empires, and its thinkers defined what it meant to be human. Today, this same Europe seems to exist only as an ashamed memory of itself, a shadow cast by the monuments of its great founders, often besmirched by their smug and self-satisfied descendants. It speaks often of values, but it no longer knows what they really mean beyond passing parliamentary majorities. It possesses wealth, at least for its elite, but not a meaningful purpose. It lives, but no longer believes in whatever it means to be truly alive. The geopolitical eclipse of Europe is not a sudden event, but it is the slow consequence of centuries of inner fatigue, of a spiritual entropy that has dissolved the unity between the true, the good and the beautiful. Once the bearer of a universal mission, organizing the journey of the individual towards transcendence, Europe has chosen comfort over meaning and process over purpose, and a certain point of view also sentiment over faith. This transformation has also redefined Europe's position in the world. Since the 16th century, Europe has started to prefer power over interiority. Now, in the 21st century, once its civilizational potential exhausted and its technology copied by other civilizations, it has lost both. Thus, for the first time since the early Middle Ages, Europe is no longer the subject of history, but its object. It moralizes without armies, it legislates without borders, and it imposes sanctions that it ultimately has to pay for by itself. The bureaucratic empire, seated in Brussels with its endless directive and its sterile vocabulary of values and rule of law and diversity, believes it can replace the tragic realism of history with an administrative dream of universal harmony, that it can impose its own passing whims as human rights unto all other civilizations. Yet, as the German jurist Carl Schmitt already warned a long time ago, the neutralization of politics is itself a political act, one that leaves the field open to those who still believe in power. Will it ever be possible to bring Europe back into true history, or are we condemned, as already announced 100 years ago by Oswald Spengler, to the post-historical existence of peripheral provinces of the American Empire? The paradox of our time is thus that Europe, the cradle of geopolitics, has ceased to think geopolitically. It speaks the language of moral universalism in a world that has returned to the logic of civilizational struggles, while Russia and China proclaim their own imperial traditions. while the United States asserts its strategic and cultural interests with growing clarity, while Islam is conquering ever larger parts of Europe and Africa through sheer demographics, and while India and Brazil start to carve out their own continental empires, Europe persists in believing that force can be replaced by law, but only the ones voted in Brussels, of course, and deterrence by dialogue, but only when the outcome corresponds to its own worldview. The results are visible to all. A continent unable to defend its borders, profoundly transformed by mass migration, dependent on imported energy, unable to guarantee its access to rare strategic resources, vulnerable to technical blackmail, and militarily subordinate to NATO and US, whose priorities are defined elsewhere. This dependence would be less tragic if Europe's and America's interests still coincided. For decades, they did. During the Cold War, both shared the same enemy and the same moral framework, and Europe, after its moral discredit in the Second World War, was mostly content to leave the difficult decisions to Washington. But the Trump era has revealed to all what most had known since the 2000s. Even formally, the transatlantic alliance is no longer an alliance of equals. America first is not an insult, but the natural expression of a nation that still possesses the will to survive. What is scandalous is not that America defends its interest, but that Europe has forgotten it even has any. From Washington's perspective, the decline in Europe has thus become a strategic periphery, a convenient market, a buffer zone, a moral laboratory for ideas that can be tested without risk. The United States is not hostile to Europe. It simply treats it as a junior partner, useful for rhetorical legitimacy and financial contribution. For all its idealism, the European Union functions today as a kind of vassal democracy, sovereign enough to preach, too weak to decide, not at all unlike the Greek city-states once Rome took over, not as an ally, but as a master. The causes of this situation are not merely political or military, they are essentially civilizational. The West's crisis of sovereignty begins with a crisis of belief. A civilization that has forgotten what it stands for and renounced any absolute truth cannot project power without hypocrisy. Once God is replaced by sheer power, nothing remains once this power is gone, except empty words. Europe's ruling class still invokes European values, but these values have been emptied of content or even turned upside down. Tolerance means de-Christianization, human dignity means abortion and euthanasia, diversity means Islamization, free speech means cancel culture, rule of law means sanctions against political enemies, equality between men and women means gender theory and LGBTQ cult, protection of the patrimony means the hate of our own history, democracy means billionaire rule, and so forth and so forth. And as a result, the continent's foreign policy oscillates between moral vanity and strategic paralysis, and is increasingly ridiculed by the other world powers. Raymond Aron once said that Europe, having renounced war, entered a dangerous quasi-post-historical illusion, as if the rest of the world had joined its pacifist utopia. The wars in Yugoslavia, Ukraine, the Caucasus, and the Middle East should have brutally ended this dream, but the message seems slow to seep into the minds of the Europeans. Instead of reminding us that power is not an anachronism and that civilization without force is merely decoration, Europe retreats further and further into abstraction and into ridicule. It multiplies resolution, funds NGOs, invests a fortune into making its military forces gender equal, and exports seminars on LGBTQ rights to countries that are busy building war drones. Behind this failure lies a deeper theological wound, the loss of faith in transcendence. Europe's political institutions were born from the Christian conviction that power is legitimate only if it serves something higher than itself, that the ruler is accountable to God, that justice has an objective content. Once that vertical line is broken,
power becomes a mere function of interests, and society dissolves into competing appetites. Globalism is simply the last phase of this disintegration, the reduction of civilization to a global marketplace governed by sentimentality, algorithms, and the ruthless appetite for money and power of elites for whom democratically elected positions are only transitory stages on their path towards even more money and power. The current European order reflects precisely this confusion. It is neither an empire nor a federation, neither a democracy nor an oligarchy, but a hybrid system whose only constant is spiritual void and material stagnation, political repression, and even moral infantilism. The ideal European citizen is not the patriot, the believer, the scholar, but a compliant consumer who recycles correctly and who votes responsibly, for the left, of course. And yet, beneath the polished surface, anger is growing, the silent resentment of peoples who feel expropriated of their identity and taxed for their own disappearance and replaced, of course, by Islam and instructed to be grateful for it. Geopolitically, this anger is dangerous, for it can be captured by forces hostile to Europe's unity. The decline of legitimacy always opened the door to the politics of resentment, and what we are witnessing today is the return of a situation reminding the crisis of the late Roman Republic, tumbling inexorably towards civil unrest or civil war, and ready to settle a lot of old accounts through violence. And yet, the eclipse of Europe may also be a prelude to an important step forwards towards its ultimate destiny. Every civilization experiences moments of exhaustion when the antithetical forces rejecting transcendence reach their culmination point and risk to destroy the civilization from within. But in such times, the end is not inevitable, as the antithesis can be overcome by a new final synthesis, where modernity is combined with a rediscovery of initial purpose, and thus the inauguration of a last, final stage similar to the Roman Empire, the Han Dynasty, the Gupta in India, or the Ramessides in ancient Egypt. For Europe, that closing synthesis can neither come from globalist utopia nor from nationalist nostalgia. It must come from a new form of civilizational patriotism, allying tradition and reason. If Europe is to survive as a political subject, it must first remember what it means to be a civilization. It must learn once again to think in centuries, not only in electoral cycles, and to act with the awareness that culture, demography, faith, and power are all inseparable. But above all, it must regain the courage to define its own interests, not against America, but at least beside it, not against the world, but for itself. For only a Europe conscious of its destiny can still be an ally worth of having. The choice that awaits us is thus not between right and left, or between reform and stagnation, but between survival and self-dissolution. And in this twilight, it is the conservatives, that is, those who still remember the meaning of the sacred and of hierarchy and of duty, of history, who must prepare the groundwork for a new dawn. Let us imagine for a moment that globalism prevails entirely across Europe. The scenario is not at all implausible, but rather, in fact, the logical endpoint of the ideology that currently dominates our institutions, universities and media. Globalism, in its European form, is not an external imposition, but has to be considered as the logical consequence of the final secularized phase of Christianity, stripped of transcendence, but preserving its universalism and also its moral vocabulary. What remains is a humanitarian religion without heaven, and a moral economy without metaphysics, and a negative anthropology but without redemption. In this future, the European Union becomes not the federation its Christian Democrat founding fathers once promised it to be, but a woke bureaucracy. Its legitimacy does not longer rest on faith or consent, but on a green leftist moral narrative. Climate justice, gender equality, inclusivity, sustainability, multiculturalism. A liturgy of virtue endlessly repeated by political clergy and media catechists. Law has ceased to express reason, it only illustrates emotion. Legitimacy no longer comes from the people, but from experts, from NGOs, or from an opaque international community. And dissent is not argued with, but pathologized as hate speech. The result would be a continent that speaks incessantly of freedom while living under permanent surveillance. A surveillance system still avoiding gulags or torture, but based on an implicit social credit system powered by artificial intelligence, social media and bureaucracy. A system Tocqueville foresaw as the soft despotism of comfort, an empire of safety and of democratic tyranny, where all risks, conflicts or views of transcendence are suppressed in the name of collective well-being and majorities. However, the moral vocabulary of this regime hides a nasty economic reality. Beneath the surface of progressive humanitarianism operates a powerful alliance between global finance, digital oligarchy, and a bureaucratic governance, colluding to destroy what remains of the middle class. The moral rhetoric of inclusivity serves as a perfect distraction from the real redistribution of power, from the citizen to the corporation, from the nation to the international networks. ESG directives, climate credits, social scoring system all function as new forms of pseudo-feudal obligation, the moral justification for the concentration of economic control. The postmodern peasant no longer pays tithes to the barons, of course, but endless subscriptions to platforms and taxes to supranational agencies, owing nothing without being truly happy. The green transition illustrates this logic perfectly. Officially, it seeks, of course, to save the planet. In practice, it destroys the industrial base of Europe, submits the citizens to the great corporations via the devaluation of property through endless regulations, transfers production and industry to Asia, and makes the continent dependent on rare strategic goods, either controlled by China or the US. The result is not sustainability, but billionaire socialism, a society of limits for the people and exemptions for the powerful. At the social level, the consequences would equally be devastating. The demographic implosion of Europe would continue, compensated not by birth, of course, but by immigration. Yet immigration, far from being a solution, becomes a tool of moral blackmail. It is no longer presented as a political choice, but as an ethical imperative, the debt of the colonizer or the duty of humanity. The nation, once defined as a community of destiny, is redefined as a logistical space where populations circulate according to the needs of the markets and the dictates of compassion. A world in which identity itself becomes a suspect category, especially when it is, of course, autochthonous. This ideology of globalism would transform Europe into what I once called a moral theme park, a civilization that survives only as a spectacle. Its cathedrals become museums, its traditions, festivals, its languages, brands. The sacred is commodified, and the beautiful is algorithmically optimized. Tourists, especially Chinese tourists, still marvel at our ruins, but no one would build new monuments. And the ugly truth of pauperization, desertification, and Islamization would be hidden or tabooed. In this future, democracy itself would become simulation. Elections would be held, debates televised, but the range of acceptable opinion would shrink even more every year. The real decisions would be taken elsewhere. Committees, boards, expert panels that answers to no one, and depend finally on the support of the billionaire Caesars of the modern West. While the patriots would be discredited as fascists, the self-declared democratic parties would only differ in slogans but not in worldviews, and would be led by variations of the same managerial class and resemble products made by artificial intelligence. The citizens, deprived of any real political influence, would retreat totally into private life or virtual activism, while the idea of the polis, of a common destiny shared by free individuals, would fade into the background noise of entertainment. Geopolitically, such a Europe would have no future. its armies would rust, its technologies would become outdated, its industries would be gradually sold. Admittedly, it could still remain relatively wealthy for a certain time, living on accumulated capital, but eventually the loss of resilience and the accumulated impact of missed reforms would become visible everywhere. And yet, the greatest danger of globalism is not only domination but discredit, because a civilization that pretends to speak for humanity but cannot even secure its own continuity and its own borders invites contempt, even more as it triggered so many resentments while it dominated the earth. When the rest of the world looks at Europe, decadent, self-hating, obsessed with guilt and comfort, it sees neither a master nor a teacher, but a warning. The West that once converted the world through its faith now preaches atheism with missionary zeal. The continent that invented the cathedral now worships the windmill. Nobody can criticize migrants for not wanting to integrate into such a collective folly. If globalism would triumph completely, Europe would thus not be conquered, but it would just dissolve. There would be no final battle, no spectacular collapse, only the quiet absorption of a once dynamic civilization into the algorithms of an international governance shared in reality by the new multipolar stakeholders and increasingly pauperized. Europe's nations would still exist as administrative zones, its people as demographic data, but the reality would be one of utter fragmentation, where the consumption potential of the Europeans would feed the bank account of Chinese or American companies, not dissimilar to the exploitation of the Sumerian city-states or the Nile Valley under countless generations of foreign invaders in antiquity. And yet, as so often in history, it is precisely in such moments of exhaustion that the possibility of reversal could appear. For when a civilization reaches the limit of its extreme abstraction, when it is denied all that made it human, the hunger for reality returns. Out of the ruins of globalism may still arise the will to rediscover the concrete, such as faith, or community, or beauty, and of course family. But for that to happen, Europe must probably first experience the full sterility of its own utopia. It must understand from the within that salvation cannot be found in universalism without God. Now, let us imagine the opposite future, one that many on the right wing, wary of Brussels and disillusioned with globalism, still are hoping for. Suppose the so-called populists triumph, the sovereigntists would take power, and the European Union, crippled by its own contradictions, would begin to unravel. Borders would be restored, national parliaments would recover authority, each people would reclaim its independency, the bureaucrats of Brussels would pack their offices, the flags of the Union would be lowered, and the continent would proclaim itself free again. At first, the atmosphere may be euphoric. Europe would seem to awaken from its technocratic nightmare, but soon the jubilation would fade. For what would follow would not be renewal, but confusion and conflict. For in the 21st century, national sovereignty without a civilizational framework would only lead to vassalization. A populist revolution, the populist revolution that many dream of, would not restore the order of Europe, but rather expose its fragmentation. Each state, suddenly liberated from the European framework, would pursue its own course. Some turning to Washington for protection, others to Moscow for gas, others to Beijing for privileged tariffs, others to Turkey for geopolitical support, and still others to the Gulf monarchies for capital. The result would not be the goals l'Europe des nations, patriots so often speak about, but an archipelago of feudal dependencies and petty rivalries. A continent that once was united by faith and culture and a common destiny would dissolve into a chessboard of external allegiances. In the 19th century, when Europe was still on top of the game, dominating the world through technology and demographics and education and military and colonies, while national rivalries led to ever greater expansion, this could still function, but today, however, the world fights back and would be all too happy to make the European nations suffer exactly the same kind of dependence it has not, or it has never forgiven them. We have seen something similar before. The Greek city-states, once united by Alexander and his successors, preferred to call in outer forces from east and west in order to get rid of the Macedonian domination, and at the end, their newly won autonomy only hid the reality of Roman provincial administration. Their civilization survived, admired by their conquerors and patrons, but their sovereignty was to remain a formal hull for the centuries to come. The same is the case with the reveling Chinese states of the Roman kingdoms, finally subjected by the semi-barbarian Qin. To be clear, the revolt against globalism is legitimate and even necessary, and the nation-state is, at least for now, still the cornerstone of European democracy and identity. No civilization can survive when its elites despise its own people and its roots, and when their legitimate forms of civic solidarity are ignored. But revolt is not enough, and destruction does not guarantee creation. The return of sovereignty cannot, by itself, restore meaning, because sovereignty is not a metaphysical absolute, but a function of power and of purpose and unity. When each European state defines itself only by its difference from its neighbor, Europe ceases to be a civilization and becomes a collection of petty revelries, ultimately leading to vassalization. The national conservatives who imagine that the dissolution of the European Union will automatically produce freedom mistake structure for essence, because they forget that Europe's crisis is not merely bureaucratic but spiritual. This means that the bureaucrats of Brussels are not the cause, but the symptom of a deeper disease, the loss of the European soul. Replacing them with national bureaucrats will not cure the illness. It may even make it worse, for the centrifugal passions unleashed by disintegration will soon require external guarantees, and external guarantees always come with foreign chains. Russia offers energy and orthodoxy, hoping to reconstitute a Eurasian sphere. China offers investment and infrastructure, buying influence through debt. The United States offers protection, but at the price of vassalage. Turkey offers a pathway to the Middle East and the management of migration. The Gulf states offer liquidity and ideology in equal measure. Each of these powers sees in Europe's disunity not a tragedy, but an opportunity. And indeed, why should they not? History's great law is simple. When the center no longer holds, the periphery intervenes. And this irony is cruel. The sovereigntist victory could well produce the very dependency it seeks to escape. By dismantling the fragile unity of the continent, the nationalists would deliver it, piece by piece, to stronger empires. The dream of independence would culminate in a new colonialism, not territorial, at least not for the beginning, but financial and cultural and military and digital. The global giants would play off one capital against another, exploiting their rivalries, dictating policy through markets, data, and migration flows. Europe would survive, but as a collection of protectorates, each boasting of its own sovereignty while obeying invisible masters. And this is not mere speculation. Already today, we see how individual European states, in their quest for autonomy, align themselves with external patrons. Hungary and Slovakia seek energy from Russia, France courts the Gulf, Italy and Greece depend on Chinese investments, Poland binds itself to Washington, Germany, after the Nord Stream sabotage, finds itself both economically weakened and militarily subordinated. Even within the European Union, solidarity has become a fiction. North against south, east against west, center against periphery. The moment the integrative pressure of Brussels disappears, these tensions will explode. And yet, one must be fair, the sovereigntists are not wrong in diagnosing the illness. Their rebellion stems from a genuine instinct of preservation, the will to defend culture, identity, and dignity against the homogenizing arrogance of globalism. But like all rebellions that lack a positive principle, this one risks destroying what little still unites us. The tragedy of the sovereigntists is that they mistake centripetal energy for unity. They believe that to restore the nation-state is to restore Europe. But Europe has never been a collection of nations. It has always been a civilization seeking again and again to restore the unity it lost when its initial core, the Holy Roman Empire, the Sacrum Imperium, was destroyed by religious, political and ideological divisions. Of course, the nations have played an important role since the beginning of the European civilization, but many of them are rather the result than the precondition of the nation-state. Indeed, until the 19th century, instead of a handful clearly delimited nations, Europe was characterized by countless diverging regional and dialectal groups, sometimes interrelated by linguistic familiarity or historical experience, but ultimately very different from each other. Only the nation-building imposed by the Enlightened ideology, exported by the French Revolution, led to the great unification and simplification whose results we witness today. Defending the nation as the ultimate defining characteristic of Europe is thus not only anachronistic but also dangerous in the current situation, as nationalism risks to destroy not only Europe but ultimately the nation-state itself. The lesson of history is clear. Fragmentation is not freedom, as the decline of empire rarely brings renaissance, but rather confusion and dependency and even decay. To avoid this fate, Europe must find a way to reconcile national sovereignty with civilizational solidarity. If globalism is the pathology of the universal, nationalism is the pathology of the particular. The first dissolves identity in abstraction, the second fossilizes it in isolation. Both are symptoms of the same disease, the loss of a transcendent center. What then remains for Europe? Between the globalist tower and the nationalist labyrinth, there must exist another path, one that reconciles unity and difference, hierarchy and freedom. That path, as we shall see, is what I call hesperialism, the reawakening of Europe as a civilization, not a market, as an organic order and not a rationalist system, as a common destiny from a certain perspective and not just as a bureaucracy or an administration. If globalism dissolves and nationalism fragments, thus what remains for Europe? Well, between the dream of the borderless market and the nightmare of a balkanized sovereignty, the third path appears, the hesperialist path. The name comes from the Hesperides, the mythical land of the setting sun, not a geographical region, but rather a typical symbol of Europe's eternal longing for all that is beyond. Hesperialism thus means the conscious reawakening of Europe as a civilization, rather than as a Kantian system of administration or as a mere economic association of states. It is both a political realism but also a spiritual revival, a synthesis of order and reason and transcendence. Europe's transition to its final civilizational synthesis must thus begin with a redefinition of what Europe truly is. Europe is not a collection of markets, nor an aggregate of legal codes, and not even a federation of nations. Europe is a cultural organism with its typical characteristic idea and destiny, animated by our unique Faustian longing and rooted in the four converging sources of the Greek love of truth, the Roman sense of order, the Christian revelation of personhood, and the barbarian sense of liberty. Hesperianism seeks to restore their harmony, philosophy that again serves the search for truth, and politics that again serves justice, law that respects the realities of nature, faith that again serves transcendence, and a liberty that again dares to reassert its proper dignity. This vision, I believe, is not nostalgic. It does not mean a naive return to medieval Christendom or to imperial nostalgia that are forever gone, but rather the translation of Europe's ancient soul into the language of modern power. The Hesperialist wants a Europe that is conscious of its sacred genealogy and therefore able to project power without shame. And in this sense, Hesperialism is neither reactionary nor utopian. It is organic traditionalism, a renewal of life through memory. Politically, hesperionism rejects both supranational bureaucracy and sterile nationalism. It conceives of Europe as a commonwealth of sovereign peoples bound by civilization, not by a globalist ideology. Each nation would retain its own constitution, language and culture, but would acknowledge a higher order of belonging, a shared responsibility for the destiny of the continent. Such an order would rest not on uniformity, but on hierarchy and subsidiarity. What can be done locally must not be centralized, but what requires unity, such as defense, foreign policy, borders, continental communications, strategic resources, future technologies, must be carried out collectively. This vision echoes the medieval principle of the Sacrum Imperium, as it has shaped our continent for more than 1,000 years, aligning subsidiarities, strength, and faith with elective government. Hesperialism thus understands federalism not as a delusion, but as a force through coordination. The European army it envisions would not be a duplicate of NATO, but an autonomous force rooted in European interests. And its diplomacy would not mimic Washington, but seek a balance between East and West. It would be a Europe capable of saying yes to alliances, but no to the supernation we have today. Indeed, geopolitically, hesperialism starts from a very simple axiom. A civilization that cannot defend itself does not deserve to survive. Europe must recover its strategic sovereignty at all price. Control over borders, energy, technology, defense, and information, implying also the ability to choose alliances freely and to endure crisis without blackmail. With the United States, hesperialism would thus envision partnership, but not dependency. Two civilizations of the West cooperating as equals. With Russia, Europe would target coexistence through strength, complementarity, and respect for limits. With China, economic engagement tempered by cultural vigilance. With Africa and the Middle East, a policy of reciprocity, not guilt. The goal would not be confrontation, but balance, the restoration of a concert of civilizations in which Europe would again become a pole rather than just a province or a periphery. In practice, this would of course require reindustrialization, demographic recovery, and the rebuilding of the European periphery, the Mediterranean, the Balkans, the Caucasus, as zones of stability rather than as migration corridors. It would mean replacing moral rhetoric with geopolitical strategy. NGOs with true statement, emotions with endurance, and multipolarity with civilization and patriotism. And, probably most important, secularism with a proud reference to Christian tradition. Europe must once again dare to think imperially, not in terms of conquest, but of responsibility to a larger supranational order. Of course, no geopolitical project can endure without a spiritual renaissance. Hesperialism affirms that the crisis of the West is first a crisis of meaning. The restoration of the sacred is thus indispensable and can only proceed through a positive relation with the Christian tradition. The continent cannot live forever in the empty neutrality of secular technocracy. It must recover the sense of being a custos sacri, a guardian of the sacred. Now, obviously, a mass re-Christianization of all Europeans is beyond the scope of the feasible. Even more so, as Europe has always been characterized by a clear distinction about the sphere of action of the political and the religious. No church power should interfere with the democratic decisions of the people. But at the same time, these decisions are only to be considered valid if they are able to refer to the framework guaranteed by transcendence and natural law. Actively de-Christianizing our civilization or negating the relevance of created nature and physical reality for legislation, as has been the case so often during these last decades, especially with gender and LGBTQ ideology, should be impossible. Indeed, without referring our political decisions ultimately to the existence of an absolute truth, all politics must degenerate into relativism, nihilism, and finally mere opportunism. where truth is decided by the one who controls the media. Economically, hesperialism advocates solidarity over speculation. It draws inspiration from the Christian social doctrine. Private property as duty, not a privilege, work as participation in creation, profit as a service, but not an idolatry. It rejects both neoliberal atomism and collectivist leveling. The goal would be to rebuild a strong middle class rooted in family, region, profession, the social body that once made Europe so resilient. Similarly, technological progress must serve human dignity, not dissolve it. Artificial intelligence, genetics, robotics, and digital governance must remain subordinated to moral limits. As a civilization that plays with transhumanism while neglecting their own children, signs its own death throes. The hesperialist economy, therefore, would link innovation to demography, tax system and social policies that reward family, continuity and transmission. At its core, hesperialism, of course, is also an ethics of limits against the boundless expansion of desire promoted by global capitalism and ethnic hedonism, and against the sterile, woke moralism of postmodern ideology. It reaffirms that freedom exists only within civilizational forms and boundaries. True liberty is not the abolition of constraint, but its voluntary acceptance in the name of a higher good. This applies as much to individuals as to nations. Self-discipline and the capacity for distinguishing between norm and exception is the first condition of sovereignty and stability, where every exception is elevated to the level of a norm, the latter loses all credibility, and people cease to compete in order to be the best expression of a civilizational archetype, but rather start to rival in victimhood and felt oppression. In sum, hesperialism therefore calls for a return to norm and virtue, not as a private sentiment, but as public law. Courage, temperance, justice, and faith must again become political categories. A society that rewards vice and ridicules virtue cannot survive. It may remain rich for a time, but it will cease to be truly civilized and sooner or later disintegrate because of its growing polarization. Every civilization that has reached a high degree of abstraction must one day return to the concrete. The dream of universal management, of history, tamed by humanism, relativism, and administration, always ends in the same way, in polarization, paralysis, revolt, and finally in the longing for a new order. Europe today approaches that threshold. Behind the apparent normality of its institutions, one feels the tremors of a coming earthquake. Inflation, migration, debt, disillusion, and of course demographic exhaustion. The surface is still calm, but underneath everything is fermenting. The question is thus no longer whether a storm will come, but who will command when it breaks. Can such a hesperialist transformation still occur peacefully? History would unfortunately suggest otherwise. Every august moment in the evolution of a civilization follows a period of trial. The Roman world had to pass through the fires of the late Republic, Iran had to experience the Matita rebellion, China, the horrors of the wars of the warring states, Egypt, the turmoil of the Amarna and post-Amarna years. Likewise, Europe may have to endure decades of unrest, economic crisis, demographic shock, cultural conflicts, before a new equilibrium emerges. The danger is immense, but so of course is the opportunity. For when the globalist edifice collapses and the nationalist reaction proves insufficient, the peoples of Europe will search for a new synthesis, something that combines stability with meaning and freedom with hierarchy. If conservatives are ready, if they possess vision rather than just nostalgia, they may become the architects of that synthesis. If not, others, less scrupulous and less humane, will take their place. The task of conservatives is therefore to prepare this moral and political restoration, to hold fast to the memory of form while the world dissolves around them, so that when the hour strikes, they may build upon the ruins of the past a new order. Now, what will be the mechanism of history if an organic hesperialist transformation fails? Well, when the creative energy of a civilization utterly wanes, when faith turns to nihilism and economy to organized corruption and institutions to oppression, a new type of leader arises, the Caesars. Their legitimacy no longer comes from law or from lineage, but from success, from charisma, from wealth, from power, and the ability to impose order amidst chaos. They do not destroy democracy, they replace it with acclamation, and the people, wary of impotence and corruption, willingly exchange their procedural law procedure for protection. But what begins as an emergency measure quickly becomes always a new form of rule, pragmatic, personal, post-constitutional, and it triggers other Caesars to do the same, transforming thus what initially was a fight over political ideas into a pure personal competition over individual power, from which finally a civilizational synthesis will emerge, though not by means of peaceful election and consensus, but of exhaustion and submission. The West, I believe, stands on the brink of such a moment, and the signs are everywhere, especially in the US. The second presidency of Donald Trump shows the evident signs of a Caesarist moment. But the tendency in the old world are the same, even though under the slightly different conditions of transatlantic dependency and left liberal ideological supremacy. Everywhere, populist leaders, and especially billionaires, have discovered the potential behind the combination between political resentment and the control over media and algorithms. And the prize, that is the ultimate control over entire continents, has never been more intriguing. Across the entire West, citizens who once demanded rights now just demand authority. They do not believe in the system anymore, but they crave security. So the hour of the administrators is ending, but the hours of the Caesars is beginning. This transition will not necessarily be violent, but it will be decisive and one way. The old liberal order, already hollowed out by technocracy and moral relativism, cannot endure indefinite crisis. Its procedures presuppose consensus, and consensus has vanished. When the next economic contraction strikes, when the welfare state becomes unsustainable, when migration overwhelms public services, when energy shortages collide with social unrest, then the temptation will become irresistible, to call forth the strong hand that promises to restore order. And that hand may emerge from the right or from the left, from the barracks or from the boardroom, but it will be hailed as salvation. For conservatives, this coming Caesarist moment represents both a danger but also an opportunity. Danger because the cult of authority easily degenerates into tyranny. Opportunity because it may open the only window through which Europe can be rebuilt. The key question is thus not whether Caesarism will come, but whether it will be guided by tradition or by self-destruction, and whether the impending upheavals will secure true civic participation and respect for individual freedoms, or whether it will be imposed by mere violence. Rome too knew several candidates for ultimate power before Octavian reaped the final victory. Be it Pompey, Caesar, or Mark Antony, all had their advantages and their flaws, but the longer the conflicts took and the more it was inevitable that their outcome would be military dictatorship. The conservatives' duty, therefore, would not be to deny the coming transformation, but to prepare and canalize it ethically in order to avoid the worst. He must cultivate among future elites a sense of measure, of justice, of faith and of duty, the virtues that distinguish authority from mere domination. If the right, the political right, abdicates this moral formation, others will seize the Caesarian moment with less scruple. The populist demagogue, the technocratic despot, the digital oligarch, all are already waiting. This preparation demands, of course, a change of attitude. Too many conservatives still believe they can go back in time and, once again, restore the society of the good old 1980s with their Thatchers and Reagans. Though this view may seem deeply sympathetic, it is thoroughly anachronistic. The fine-tuned balance between tradition and liberty that had shaped this bygone period was a unique historical moment, a fleeting equilibrium between the last forces of the old world and the yet unsure powers of modernity. The historical cycle is not made for returning back in time for 1 or 2 generations, but by advancing a bit more, it will tie back to its initial beginning. All this does not mean surrendering to determinism or even defeatism. True hesperiјализam, as outlined above, insists that form must serve transcendence. Caesarism without spirit is mere tyranny, and spirit without power, of course, is impotence. The synthesis of both would be the true task of the conservative of the future. Its goal would not be domination but protection, to preserve and protect conditions in which truth and beauty and faith can once again flourish. In this sense, the conservative task in the coming storms resembles that of part of the senatorial elites during the fall of the Roman Republic. They could not save the old structures, which had utterly discredited themselves through populism and corruption, but they could try to preserve the soul and the memory of the past. Likewise, in the chaos that follows the crisis of the woke globalist liberalism, those who still believe in order, in family and faith must become the custodians of continuity. Their institutions, schools, parishes, think tanks, local communities, academies, will form the seeds of the post-liberal world and, hopefully, build a framework for a final civilizational synthesis for Europe. But what if the storm turns against us? If one of the Caesars to come is hostile to everything we defend? Then, of course, resistance will again become duty. The conservative does not worship power for its own sake. He accepts it only when it serves truth. To obey injustice is not conservatism, but just cowardice or opportunism. Yet the greatest danger today is not oppression, but entropy. Not the tyrant, but the civilizational void. Even an unjust order can still be corrected. Chaos cannot. That is why, paradoxically, the conservative may sometimes welcome authority, not because it is perfect, but because it makes civilization possible. The decisive factor will thus be the moral quality of the elites who arise from the crisis. In the late Republic, moral exhaustion produced civil war. Yet out of that war emerged Augustus, who restored peace by binding power again to piety. The same could happen again. It is to be expected that the 21st century will not be ruled by assemblies, but by powerful personalities whose influence over media, technology, institutions and finances are bigger than anything we experienced during the last decades. Whether those personalities are humane or monstrous will depend on what ideas have been sown before the storm, and that is basically our task. Thank you very much.
Izvolite, znači imamo, ja se zahvalio Davidu, knjiga je još bolja, dakle on je probao da napravi jednu sintezu onoga što je napravljeno u knjizi, dakle kao analiza problema u kome se Zapad u nekom širem smislu nalazi, pogrešnih rešenja i kretanja i ponude toga što on naziva hesperijalizmom, kao idejom obnove, dakle, zapadne u nekom širem smislu civilizacije. Ova ideja civilizacije je vrlo važna, jer on polazi od toga što, recimo, Rusija poslednjih nekoliko godina je vratila ideju da sebe predstavlja kao civilizaciju. Kina, naravno, to jeste po definiciji i dakle, ono što je, da istaknem dve stvari na kraju, vrlo je važan taj model ideje civilizacije, on onda pita šta će biti sa Evropom, dakle, da li Zapad može sebe da odbrani i produži svoj život kao civilizaciju s jedne strane. I druga stvar koja je na kraju pokazala vrlo hrabro i lepo i u drugim svojim spisima, a i u ovoj knjizi, vrlo lepo pokazuje da je savremena demokratija daleko od onoga što demokratija jeste bila i što treba da bude. Dakle, o tome su ljudi još 500 godina pisali, dakle, da ono što je osnova demokratije, racionalna javna diskusija, to više ne postoji. Ne postoje slobodni mediji, postoji manipulacija i kao posljedica toga on kaže, očigledno 21. vek koji ide danas neće biti vek demokratije u tom nekom smislu, nego vek jakih ličnosti ili onoga što Špengler naziva cezarima, gdje već vidimo te razne moćne ljude i ono što on vraća, što je zadatak ljudi, tradicije ili konzervativaca, to je da insistiraju na vrednostima i da ti cezari koji budu vladali budu dobri, normalni i da rade u interesu vrednosti umjesto da brane čistu moć. Otprilike, to su neke dve, da kažem, dosažene osnovne poruke koje nam je predstavio. Imamo prostora za komentare, pitanja, izvolite, ja ću prevesti na engleski, a on će odgovarati pa ćemo govoriti. Znači, samo molim vas kod pitanja da bude kraće, da bismo mogli da prevedemo i da on može razumjeti o čemu se dešava. Izvolite.
I'll do in English and then you will translate it.
Okay.
David, thank you for sharing with us your wisdom and the traces of hope for the European future. My name is Jon Filipovic. I'm a professor at Belgrade University School of Organizational Sciences. I would like you to comment on how you envision the process, the concrete process, through which hesperiјализам is to prevail over neo-functionalism, the mean concept that Europe uses to devoid us of our sovereignty. Also, as an engineer, I'm interested in how techno-feudalism and platform capitalism fit into all this mess. And at the end, talking about entropy, I don't think that Europe needs to become another pole in a multipolar world. I think that Europe needs to become a node in a multinodal world.
Molim te prevedi za...
Da, zahvalio sam se na tome što je podelio sa nama svoju mudrost i te tračke nade u vezi evropske budućnosti i zamolio sam ga da prokomentariše konkretan način na koji će njegov koncept da kako se zove, prevlada u odnosu na neofunkcionalizam, taj zli koncept kojim Evropa pokušava da nas liši suvereniteta. Zamolio sam ga također da prokomentariše kako Varoufakisov feudalizam i platformski kapitalizam služe Evropi u tim zlim namerama i na kraju rekao sam da, pošto je pomenuo entropiju, mislim da Evropa ne treba da bude jedan od polova u ovom multipolarnom svetu, već jedno od čvorišta u tom svetu koji će biti sastavljen od mreže i više tih čvorova.
So first concerning, I really like that picture of a node in a multinodal world. So I think that I will take that over. That is very nicely said.
You know, poles, they are at opposite sides of the globe. And as such, they create entropy because they are on the opposite sides. But nodes, they are part of the same network. And as such, you know, they work hand in hand.
Yeah, that is really a nice picture, even though probably I myself would rather be an advocate of first cutting whatever link makes us dependent, because of course a nodal system has this advantage of keeping everything in a certain form of balance, but it creates of course also dependencies, and it creates of course the possibility of very asymmetrical forms of links. But it's a very nice image. So I think that is absolutely.
They destroyed the Nord Stream.
Yeah.
It's a part of the network.
Yeah, exactly. So that is
just for the other, sorry. Dakle, imamo vrlo važnu diskusiju, sad smo već ušli u ozbiljnu debatu o koncepcijama tog budućeg sveta, u kome je on predstavio svoju ideju o čvorovima i međusobnim...
Nije izvorno moje.
Čuo sam. Okej, ali recimo, ovo je vrlo zanimljiva. David kaže s druge strane da to jeste zanimljiva ideja, ali iz njegove perspektive je opasna u smislu što ti čvorovi znače i zavisnost i mogućnost asimetrične zavisnosti. Vrlo je zanimljivo prosto kao debata o konceptima.
But of course, the fundamental question is how do we get there? So this is the most important element. So of course, I guess we all would hope for realizing hesperiolism through democratic organic process, but I don't really believe in that anymore. Obviously, I think time is too short. If we try to create the usual system with political parties and think tanks and trying to get people and media, and so even in the best of cases that could take 15, 20 years, which we do not have. If we would realize hesperiolism through democratic, slow means, it could mean arriving at power at a moment where this power has become useless, basically, because Europe is so behind everything as dependencies are rising very soon for the moment that even dystopian conditions like mass surveillance are increasing so rapidly that we do not have much time. So indeed I see there's an urgency. So yeah, it goes, I continue after.
Okay. Dakle, u smislu odgovora na ono što je profesor Glinković pitao, dakle, kojim putem i kojim modelima doći do realizacije hesperiorizma, David ponavlja vrlo izričito da klasična organska demokratija danas nije funkcionalna, ne može da pomogne, dakle, onaj klasični sistem stvaranja novih partija, izbora i tako dalje, gotovo dakle, da to prosto danas zbog urgencije problema sa kojima se Evropa suočava. Evropa strahovito kasni, dakle, u nizu suštinskih pitanja, dakle, koja ne može da reši od tehnološkog zaostatka i da raznih drugih pitanja koja ne može da reši, i on misli u pitanju da li je, recimo, klasična demokratija način vraćanja, da to nije put jer se previše kasni.
Okay, I see it must be shorter. So we can expect and perhaps at the same time hope for more something like a crisis model. We can, I know this sounds perhaps cynical, but if we really want to change things, we have to change them very rapidly, and I think that can only go through a crisis. Now, there are quite a lot of countries in Europe that are at the border of crisis, especially France, of course, the UK for the moment also. So we could hope that crisis could produce some form of accelerationism that would be very ambiguous, because on the one hand it could mean that entire parts of our continent, and perhaps everything, could fall into disastrous situation, because if France falls, then obviously we will have a huge debt crisis that will touch all the other nations. But at the same time, from such a model could rise perhaps more quickly than from another model the alternative we are hoping for. But of course this is an extremely dangerous path that can lead as well to disaster as to all forms of government we would not like, but I fear that there is not really another option. The democratic solution takes too much time. A crisis solution is something we cannot really hope for, but which at the same time is probably the only way that could trigger such a transition, which is of course why all our systems are currently playing for time, trying to keep up the system for yet another 4 years or yet another 5 years, taking yet over another huge debt crisis in order to avoid that the crisis can arise at a moment when things can still be saved, and so that crisis works rather as a confirmation of the current order than a catalyst of transformation.
Da probam ukratko, dakle, da vraćajući se na to kojim putem ići, David je opet opisao kako sadašnji sistem, nastojeći da navodno rešava krizu, zapravo produbljuje tu krizu koja svake 4 godine ponavlja isti sistem, dakle, posle problema dolazi novi problem. To je kao što, recimo, ajde da ilustrujemo da se velike finansijske krize rešavaju novim bablovima, dakle, novim upumpavanjem novca koje će da odgodi slom sistema za još 4 godine. U tom smislu on vraća na ono, ajde kažemo, hajdegerijansko čuvenu dilemu, dakle, tamo gde je opasnost, tamo je izazov, ali i mogućnosti. Dakle, da govori o vladi krize, dakle, da kriza različita u kojoj Evropa danas klizi, dakle, od pre svega finansijske, recimo, pominje Francuska je na ivici bankrota, dakle, to je stepen zaduženosti na nivou od 5%, dakle, godišnjeg budžeta, već se govori o tome da je stave pod nadgledanje MMF-a, i on upozorava na to da akceleracija, ubrzavanje takvih stvari može da dovodi do sloma čitavog sistema, kao što je, recimo, ekonomski potencijalni slom Evropske unije, jer bi se takve izabrala, ali s druge strane da je to izazov za neku efikasniju vladu koja bi efikasnije resetovala ceo sistem i vratila, i to je ono čime je završio, dakle, vratila na neku održivu sistem, jer ovo nije održiv sistem.
And just to respond to the last part on tech feudalism, I don't have a very good answer to that. I myself fear a lot what is happening for the moment, for my own kids, for my family, for our future. Tech feudalism, artificial intelligence, the combination with robotics and genetics and transhumanism and posthumanism is creating a horrible future for us. I don't think we can really avoid that, because competition is such that if we do not use this form of weapons, the Chinese will do so anyway, and probably the Americans also. So it's difficult to escape a weapons race, even though I personally would prefer it and would rather prefer not use anything of that myself instead of using that. But as a historian, I think that, as a historian, I fear this will be unavoidable, and not sure if. And I fear this is unavoidable, and very probably the Caesars of this Caesarist moment of European history will be people like Elon Musk and all the other similar tech lords. They will probably be the Caesars, and there is a risk that indeed future will be dictated by one of them. And we can only hope, from a certain point of view, that the one who takes over will be the least dangerous of all. But I can't see, for the moment, I'm sorry if this is really pessimist, but for the moment I cannot imagine that the Western civilization will have enough maturity to deal with that in a responsible way, such as the Pope, for example, has been proposing it in yesterday's encyclica on transhumanism and artificial intelligence. So I think it will be part of this transformation process into Caesarism, and it may give to all this a dystopian character. I personally dislike fundamentally, but I can't see how we will escape that.
Maybe orthodoxy is the answer.
Dakle, ovo je vrlo važan odgovor bio. Drugo pitanje profesora Filipovića je bilo u vezi ovoga što se sada moram kažem, malo pogrešno u smislu termina Varoufakisov izraz tehnofeudalizam, ali je mnogo bolje bilo tehnokapitalizam ili tehnomonopoli na neki način, ali odgovor Davidu bi bio da kao istoričar, kao čovek, kao otac troje dece se užasava, dakle, onoga što taj model dominacije, veštačke inteligencije, tehnosistema, digitalizacije, transhumanizma, dakle, što je sve povezano, možemo da dodamo i bioloških transformacija, i donosi svetu. Međutim, i kao čovek koji analizira globalnu politiku i kompeticiju sila, on kaže da je taj distopijski karakter koji donosi taj sistem je nažalost neizbežan, jer ukoliko, ne znam, zapadni sistem to odluči da odbaci, Kinezi ga svakako neće odbaciti i tako dalje. Da dolazi u jednu situaciju gde će ove civilizacije koje vladaju dominantno tim novim mehanizmima, koje on naziva novim oružjem, zapravo koristiti to za pojačavanje svoje moći jedni protiv drugih i da je to prilično jeziv sistem. I takođe je pomenuo da su ovi tehnomoguli, da tako kažemo, poput Ilona Maska, ljudi koji imaju ogromnu količinu moći, mislim, evo za ilustraciju, zapravo Elon Musk ima danas jači kosmički program nego vjerojatno Sjedinjene Američke Države same i tako dalje. U tom smislu količina moći, novca i tehničkog progresa koje imaju omogućava njima moguće da oni budu ti Cezari novog doba koji će dominirati ovim prostorima, što definitivno nije model koji bi on želeo, i upravo to je razlog za afirmaciju hesperiјalizma i ovih vrednosti kojima bi mogli dobiti možda bolje vladare za budućnost. Dejan Perišić.
Upravo sam neka tiheta. Imam jednu konstataciju i jedno pitanje, pokušat ću meni što se vrati naravno uz zahvalnost našem gostu koji nam je zaista prikazao, da kažem, jedan primjer te stare evropske kulture, sistematične, ozbiljne, duboke i tako da. Međutim, dakle, prvo sumnja u mogućnost očite dobrog Cezara. Mislim da je to očekivati dobrog Cezara kao očekivati tigra vegetarijanca. I mislim da je u krajnji u vreme Oktavijana, da je u njemu vreme Hristos došao, tako da ne treba da očekujemo da bi Hristos dolazak nego dobrog Cezara. Sa druge strane, ono što mi je zapravo pitanje jeste, vidim da je vaša misla zasnovana na hrišćanskoj tradiciji. Rekao bih sa dodacima antičke misli, etičke misli. I sada postavlja se pitanje, ta tradicija, hrišćanska tradicija podrazumeva posvećenost, podrazumeva mučenike u prva 3 veka hrišćanstva. Postoje zapadne tradicije koje pripadate monaško-viteške redove, monaške redove uopšte. Dakle, da li danas ima posvećenosti u zapadnoj Evropi?
Vrlo lepa formulacija, pa ću probati da ne ispustim nešto, ako ispustim, podsjetite mi. First, our friend is a theologian by his vocation, basically, and teacher of the faith in the primary school, I think. High school, sorry. Dealing with publicistic as well and so on. So he first wanted to express gratitude for your presentation coming from a classical, dignified European Christian tradition, which is not very often possible to hear these days. Then he had some observation and one question. So observation was concerning the possibility and idea of really trusting into good Caesar. So he's returning to the time of Octavian, and he said, well, at that time, we should not forget that actually that was the time that the Christ came actually. So what he said, maybe instead of hoping for a good Caesar, maybe we should hope for a second coming as something which is ahead of us. And the question was, so he reminded us actually that this noble tradition you're emphasizing in your book, and actually he's speaking about this tradition of the noble knights and sacrifice and everything like that. So he reminded us that it was this kind of idea of sacrifice for some higher good, including the preparedness to sacrifice its own life and so on, has been basically enshrined into the tradition of the dignified Western tradition that we are trying to preserve and so on. And he asked, do you see that still alive at the West?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think both questions are interrelated from a certain point of view. So, of course, we can all hope for the second coming happening in our lifetime. That would be, of course, wonderful. At the same time, anyway, we will experience it at the moment of our death, one moment or the other. So if there's one certainty, is that we all will learn one day the solution of these mysteries. But what is interesting in that question is that the moment of the advent of a civilizational empire, like under Augustus or the Han Empire or other empires, is a moment of a short-lived religious restoration, like the Roman religion that was restored by Augustus, or the Chinese religion under the Han dynasty. But that restoration very often remains quite formalistic and superficial, explaining why in all these late civilizations we have the possibility and the risk of either new or foreign religions streaming in. And that is what happened, of course, in classical antiquity with Christianity, that filled in the void of a post-historical, decadent, cynical Roman Empire that longed for transcendence and welcomed Christianity. That happened in the Han Empire with the Chinese, where Buddhism streamed in because traditional Chinese religion had become formalized and paralyzed. And of course that could be a risk also with Europe, because if the current decline of faith and the current cynicism and the lack of credibility of tradition and Christianity continues, that could mean that Europe too could become a potential spiritual vacuum in which other religions could become strong, like Islam, for example. So there could be a real risk of seeing Islam playing, from a certain point of view, the role that Buddhism played in China, that Christianity played in the Roman Empire, and to see also something like mass conversions to Islam, or God knows what other religion, if Christianity does not manage to be credible enough. One example, then I will leave to the translation, one example where such a new religion did not manage to enter was Japan. Japan, under the Tokugawa shogunate, saw the influx of Christianity. Christianity as a religion that in Japan played a little bit the role of Christianity in the Roman Empire, with a formalized Japanese religion longing for new religion. And the Tokugawa shogunate blocked that, persecuted even Christianity, but managed, from a Japanese point of view, to defend its own Shinto and Buddhism religion. So, I mean, as a civilizational historian, we could hope for a restored Christian Europe to block also this possibility of foreign cults or religions to take over our own civilizational sphere in this moment of spiritual void.
So, ovo je bio jedan mali esej zapravo, sad ću ja probati da to nekako lepo prevedem. David se zahvalio kolegi Perišiću, dakle, na odličnom uvidu i kaže da su ove dve stvari zapravo vrlo međusobno povezane, i onda je razmatrao tu ideju, naravno najpre odgovorio na ovu observaciju da također kao hrišćanin on se nada da za našeg života možda možemo observirati second coming, odnosno drugi dolazak Gospoda, ali, kaže, samim činom, dakle, smrti i otkrivanjem misterija posle toga ćemo biti u mogućnosti da saznamo direktno ili lično tu istinu. Onda je posle dao zaista jedan mali lep esej o tome šta se dešava sa religijom i šta se može očekivati u ovakvim vremenima. I on ima u knjizi, recimo, vrlo lepo poglavlje o tezi, antitezi i mogućoj sintezi. Naprimer, kad je zapadni prostor, teza kao hrišćanstvo, antiteza prosvetiteljstva i pokušaj negde kasnog obnove hrišćanstva, dakle kao neka moguća sinteza danas. Međutim, on kaže da kroz istoriju smo bili svedoci da u civilizacijama se to dešavalo, dakle da u kasnoj fazi po pravilu postoji, kao i u vreme Avgusta, dakle pokušaj obnove tradicionalne religije u nekoj civilizaciji, koji po pravilu su uglavnom bili formalistički, akademski, ne zaista sa onim žarom koji je religija u prvoj svojoj objavi imala. I onda je razne te primere kao što je Avgust, dakle, koji je probao da obnovi rimsku tradicionalnu republikansku religiju, ili, dakle, kineska dinastija Han, koja je probala da revitalizuje svoju, opet, konfučijansku tradiciju. Međutim, s druge strane, pokazuje se i česti su primjeri da zbog tog formalizma zapravo neka nova i snažna, živa religija uđe i rasproste se na tom prostoru. I on kaže kako danas izgleda na prostoru Evrope, zapravo islam je najživlja religija i da to je čak možda zamislivo koje se širi što zbog muslimana i što, ili recimo u Nemačkoj, gde je nemali broj Nemaca prelazi, na primjer, na islam ili u drugim delovima i da, recimo, to je zamislivo, na primjer, da se islam proširi i ovlada nad hrišćanstvom koje eventualno ne bi uspelo da se obne na neki način. Međutim, daje i zanimljive historijske primere, kao što je, recimo, Japan za vreme dinastije Tokugawa, koji je represijom i, dakle, opet izolovanošću nekog uspeo da spreči da, uslovno rečeno, strana religija, a to je hrišćanstvo, uđe i rasprostre se i očuvaju svoj šinto i budističku tradiciju. Dakle, u tom smislu bi i evropska civilizacija mogla da se odbrani eventualno, dakle, od tih nekih novih religija uz možda jači sistem represije. Sad ću ja morati da iskoristim ovde, da mu postavim jedno kratko pitanje. I will add one question. I have to mention Chantal Delsol, actually, since we have the chance to present her book about return of paganism. Podsjećam na Chantal Delsol, profesorku koju smo dovodili ovdje, koja ima sjajnu knjigu od 100 strana, ali briljantnu knjižicu od pre 4-5 godina, koja se izvorno zove Kraj hrišćanstva, hrišćanskog prostora i obnova paganizma. And as we know, just to remind her basic argument, actually, that after the fall of Christianism, since many people speak that Europe is now post-Christian society, well, people have to believe in something, and she claims that we already perceive return of paganism in many ways, including bioethical issues like abortion and many other things. So, how do you perceive her idea, hypothesis that actually neo-paganism is maybe the dominant religion nowadays in some sphere and so on? Znači, ja sam ponovio taj argument profesorke Delsol, koja tvrdi da ljudi prosto moraju da veruju u nešto i da s obzirom na to da se danas živimo u post-hrišćanskoj Evropi, ona tvrdi da se vraćamo zapravo u paganizmu i tu sam pomenuo i ove primere poput abortusa, eugenike, surgacije i meni mnogo tih nekih bioetičkih praksi koje su bliže paganizmu nego hrišćanstvu.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, it depends a bit on how we define paganism. If we define paganism in the old way, as really true elaborated mythology, like the ancient Germans or the Slavic people or the Greeks or so, with really a refined kind of mythology, rites, cult, priests, and so on. I don't see that yet coming. I think that there is, of course, neo-paganism as a LARPing, real-life role-playing tradition that is starting again in some milieus, but in general I don't think that we can see something like that. But if we understand, of course, neo-paganism or paganism in a more vague sense of some form of transactional pantheism and something that is situated in between atheism, pantheism, strong superstition, magical practices, syncretism, false esotericism. That is indeed something that is happening more and more for the moment, and that is typical, like Spengler would say, for everyday civilization, because this is not a true religion in that sense. It is rather some byproduct of the dissolution of proper civilizational forms and the strange mixture between, let's say, very archaic, atavistic beliefs that are not anymore sublimated by true religion, and of course very high elaborated civilizational forms that are used only in very specific contexts. So that such a kind of neo-paganism, if we define it like that, could indeed be possible. And it would help us also to respond to the second part of his question, asking for if it's still possible for Europeans to sacrifice themselves for higher goods in the true tradition of the Christian knight. And I think there are still some elites that are capable of that. I see a bit everywhere in Europe, especially in countries like France, for example, where the decline is the most progressed. The possibility of having such a young elite of patriotic, deeply Christian, deeply traditional people ready to sacrifice themselves in a very courageous way for tradition, that exists, but I think it is very marginal. Still, it could be enough to be a certain vector of civilizational transformation towards a civilizational empire, but I don't think that as a collective instinct we are still capable of that. I think that we are post-historical beings more and more, that most people on the streets are what Spengler would call Felachen. So post-historical fellas who live outside of history, and I think the readiness to die for a transcendent ideal is something that has broadly disappeared. That may come back in 100 or 200 years, in what Spengler calls the second religiosity from a certain point of view, with the return of a positive barbarianism perhaps even, but in our current state as late civilizational post-historical beings, I think this can only be a very small elite symptom.
Opet jedan sjajan mali esej, ovo stvarno treba da pretočimo pošto Joachim believe that you're actually giving us small essays which are really very nice for development, for the actual moment actually. Dakle, najpre razradio ovo na što sam ja odgovorio, ali na kraju i počet ću od toga odgovorio na Dejanovo drugo pitanje, dakle, da li su ljudi u Evropi spremni za žrtvu pre svega, i kaže, apsolutno, dakle, u tom nekom fundamentalnom smislu, kao što je ranije bilo, su mase ljudi želeli da poginu, da daju život za razne vrednosti za hrišćanstvo, pred svega i ono što su videli tako. To danas ne postoji, naravno. Mi smo, tu citara Špenglera, doba Felaha, dakle, ljudi koji žive van istorije, u svom nekom malom svetu i životu, ali kaže da, recimo, i to je zanimljivo, posebno u zemljama koje su možda najviše pod uticajem ili pod pritiskom da se odreknu te tradicije hrišćanstva, kao što je, recimo, Francuska, da upravo tamo se možda nađu male, ali izuzetno jake grupe mladih ljudi koji su spremni na žrtvu, maksimalno uključujući čak i fizičku borbu za ono u šta veruju i za borbu za hrišćanstvo. Naravno, to, kako kaže, nije dovoljno za tu punu obnovu društva, ali održava ono što je zapravo stvorilo Evropu, a to je spremnost ljudi za žrtvu, za odricanje, za veru u neke više stvari osim materializma. E sad, ono što sam ja pitao, da li je možda paganizam, kao što Chantal Delsol tvrdi, zapravo ta vera koja polako ulazi i širi se Evropom, i on je rekao, dakle, možemo govoriti zapravo o dve vrste neopaganizma. S jedne strane, ako bi pod neopaganizmom podrazumevali ono što je obnova tradicionalnih kulteva ili tradicionalnih predhrišćanskih sistema vere, kao što su recimo bili kod Vikinga pre svega i ono što su tevtonske tradicije, što po tim podrazumevamo, znači germanske, ali recimo slovenski panteon tih bogova i tako dalje, to u svakom slučaju ne vidimo kao živo u smislu tih mitova, obnova, posvećenja tome i tako dalje. Ali s druge strane kaže, ako pod neopaganizmom podrazumevamo ovaj jedan sinkretizam gde spada New Age, na primjer, obnova ili pakovanje tih nekih različitih pseudo-religioznosti, i tu podsjeća na Šteglera koji je puno pisao o tome da u tim nekim kasnim fazama ljudi traže da prave neke sinkretičke stvari gde mešaju neka svoja viđenja vere sa prethodnim, budućim i tako dalje, i onda je to razvio onako pokazujući kako izgleda ta neka, uslovno rečeno, mixture ili smeša tih različitih kvazi-religioznih verovanja. U tom smislu, kaže, možemo govoriti zapravo o širenju neke vrste sinkretičkog neopaganizma kao nečega što generaciju društvenih mreža, da tako kaže, mnogo više uzbuđuje nego recimo klasično hrišćanstvo i tako dalje, ali često ni ne znaju zapravo da ispovedi ovaj neki moj mali dodatak o maginskim vrednostima.
Kratko, profesor.
Izvolite, pravi.
Ovako, pre svega kao jezičar čestitam na prevodu, ne znam ko je prevodio, tako je pismeno prevedeno da primete. Prve dve rečenice mi lično smete, to nije bitno. Ja sam zapisala jednu rečenicu da danas turisti se dive ruševinama, muzejima i tako dalje. Možda prevesti ćemo brže ići. Da, ali recimo Dostojevski je bio 60. i 70. godina u Evropi, pisao je, zaboravio sam kom svom prijatelju, i rekao je, Evropa je groblje. Istina, divno, prekrasno groblje. Divno, ali groblje. Misleći na teren, da tako kažem, na zemlje gde nema ideje, gde nema vere. U tom smislu i govorio Dostojevski. Pitanje je, ako može da odgovori iz njegovog izlaganja, gospodinovog izlaganja, kaže obnova života kroz pamćenje. Kroz koje pamćenje, koji period Evrope je ideal, da tako kažem, ili neko merilo, šta treba zapamtiti da bi se nastavilo dalje?
So you understand a little bit, but basically let me try to emphasize that she reminds that already Dostoevsky in the 60s and 70s traveling spoke about that actually it's absolutely beautiful, wonderful, but actually that already at that time the faith was lacking behind and missing. So, and she then wanted you that actually the culture or the remembering and is something that might help us to regain that, but she asks you what should we remember or take out of that, like we say, museum of which kind of beliefs, knowledge and so on and so on.
Znači, koji period?
Which period?
Koja treba da se zapamti?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that Misha already alluded a little bit to how the book is structured and what kind of response I would give. Indeed, I think that the history of all civilizations, and also that of Europe, can be divided into dialectical phases, with the first phase, of course, that is anchored in transcendence and the belief of an afterworld and a holistic, hierarchized society, everything just structured around this wish for transcendence. And the second phase, an antithetical phase, where, of course, God is replaced by the human being, and theology is replaced by philosophy, and the soul is replaced by expansion, and so forth. So this difference between you could say transcendence and immanence, or even materialism on the other. And I think that the main transition happens in the 16th century, obviously, with the advent of Protestantism that destroys the unity of the Roman Church, with the advent of the nation states that destroys this idea of the Sacrum Imperium, with the advent also of falsely understood humanism and Renaissance that shows away the Middle Ages and want to tie back to an idealized antiquity, with the discovery of the New World, and so the relativization of one's own world, the beginning of the working together of Christian states like France with the Ottoman Empire against the Emperor, for example. All these different elements show that we have a transition in the 16th century between these two phases. And so, and of course, this wish to create a new humanist society has its tragical and heroic aspect. Of course, the discovery of the world, the conquest of science, etc. All that is deeply admirable, but it is at the same time very tragic, because it alienates the human being from God and somehow brings him to the belief that he is alone the measure of all things. And this is, I think, a deep problem that becomes more and more obvious, that culminates today in wokeism, which is the ultimate expression of falsely understood humanism, and that explains why, since the 16th century, we have this impression of a growing decadence. And so the answer to the question would be, what are the elements we should tie back to? Well, on the one hand, of course, we have to accept our past, that is true. We have to accept even the tragical elements of our past, because even many of the errors still produced magnificent results, even if they were erroneous from the beginning. In art history, this becomes obvious, in art, in music, in philosophy, and so on. So we have to accept this past of being part of ourselves, but ultimately, I think that only those elements of the European civilization that are still anchored in transcendence and belief are the only ones that are ultimately worth preserving and trying to build on again. I hope that is not too abstract, but that would be a bit the response to you.
Dakle, on je samo ponovio ovo što je struktura knjige, ima ono što sam, taj jedan dijalekt...
Sam ja dobro postavila pitanje.
Ne, jeste dobro...
Ne, interesovalo, koji vek?
Ne može, probat ću da objasnim, Radika.
Ali znam da ne može.
Ne, polako, mogu da objasnim šta je čovjek rekao, samo malo, da se držimo hvala. Dakle, govorio je o tome da prosto on je pokazuje da u svakoj civilizaciji, dakle, kažemo na tragu Špenglera, prati kako zapravo različite civilizacije prolaze kroz maltene iste faze i da osnovni period zapravo isto i u zapadnoj civilizaciji jeste period transcendencije, dakle, vezan za hrišćanstvo naravno, istinske vere, posvećenosti vere koje traje recimo do 16. veka, koji je doba tranzicije ključne po njemu. Tada dolazi taj period antiteze, zapravo, kao što znamo, veću reformizma na neki način sa Luterom, kreće nešto što iz katoličke perspektive jeste dekadencija, dakle, odustajanje od te transcendencije, ideje zajednice i tako dalje, ali s druge strane to je otvorilo sa prosvetiteljstvom neke fizičke, materialističke snage koje su Evropi donele izuzetne proboje u pitanjima nauke, pitanjima, ne znam, filozofije, materije i tako dalje, i stvorilo veliku snagu, dakle, i dominaciju Evrope za sledećih nekoliko vekova. Međutim, u isto vreme, i to je ta dijalektika, koja je imala i tragični deo, tragičnu posledicu toga da je to u duhovnom smislu bila jedna kontinuirana dekadencija koja je dovela do ovoga o čemu priča Dostojevski, i da ono zašto se on zalaže danas, dakle, ta vrsta sinteze, dakle, koja bi morala da uvaži tragične elemente i sve, bi morala da proba da se zasniva na nekoj ozbiljnom shvaćanju transcendencije. I on kaže da je to možda previše abstraktno, da on nema konkretan program šta i kako bi išlo, ali da to jeste ideja obnove neke duhovnosti i transcendencije na kojoj bi to moglo da se gradi nadalje. Dakle, i ja sam, zima se samo sad je 8:10, radimo već više od 2 sata, i za kraj možda još jedno pitanje, ili da zamolimo predsjednika da pitanjem ili komentarom zatvori polako i da završavamo, što kaže, večerašnje druženje.
Ja bih rado da postavim pitanje, meni je ovakve diskusije zaista sjajna i hvala svim učesnicima i svim koji su prisustvovali, zaista sjajan intelektualni trenutak, velika zahvalnost Davidu Engelsu. Ali ono što bih ja, mada naziram da će odgovor, želeo da me pitam jeste kako se on odnosi prema onome što jeste jedna od razdelnih tačaka unutar svake ideje Evrope. To je deoba na zapadno i istočno rimsko carstvo. Iz naše perspektive zapravo jedino, to su dva lica Evrope koje treba objediniti unutar sinteze o kojoj govori i David Engels. Ukoliko bi se to strateški prihvatilo kao polazna pozicija, onda bi mnogi problemi koji se danas pojavljaju na prostoru Evrope svakako mogli lakše da se reši nego što bi to bio slučaj ako isključivo zapadno-centrično zamišljamo Evropu. To je jedna vrlo opasna ideja i ona odmah otvara ideje i rasizma, imperializma svakako, osvajanja prostora i tako dalje i tako dalje.
S tim što on samo lezima se, on u knjizi vrlo precizno kaže da Rusija, koja samo sebe definiše civilizacija, dakle iz te perspektive nije deo Zapada, jer ona sebe ne vidi kao deo Zapada. On onda pokušava da definiše to, ali je naravno sad ono što je relevantno pitanje, postavimo kako on vidi ostatak, dakle, pravoslavnog sveta, dakle, kakav je odnos prema pravoslavlju, možemo tako da vidimo. So, you basically understood, actually. No, okay, I will, well, President first expressed huge gratitude for wonderful academic and intellectual feast, we could say, that we had during these 2 hours, which inspired a lot of ideas, and he thanked to all the people who were with us. But then he asked about your perception and your, let me say, relationship toward the Orthodox world. I mean, generally, it's of course the issue, from this perspective, we know, of course, Western Christendom and Eastern Christendom and tradition of Byzantine, the one in which we are Eastern Roman Empire, and yeah, of course, and Eastern Christianity to which we are belonging. And I mentioned that in the book you are very precisely defining that Russia, which defines itself as a civilization by definition, you don't see that as a part of European, in that sense, hesperial civilization, because it defines itself. But then again, the question is, how do you perceive the rest of us, Orthodox world, and how do you see the future relationship of the Western, Christendom, if I could say, or hesperial system of civilization with the Eastern, especially Orthodox tradition?
It's an extremely difficult question. I feared that someone would ask that, of course, to me, because I'm not sure I really have an answer to that. I mean, let's say from a Western perspective, only only from a geostrategical and geopolitical perspective. Of course, it would be extremely nice to have the entire Balkan in let's say, a civilization European state. That is really obvious. Now, when it comes to defining whether Serbia or Bulgaria, for example, are now part of the European civilization or not, I think that is, of course, first the choice of the people itself. I'm not sure if it is me he was to decide upon that or not. I think it is first something that has to be decided upon and felt by the people, even more so as these situations are a bit of political oddities. Spengler would say that it is the proper of the Russian civilization of being essentially boundless, of being precisely not organized in classical nation states, but of being in this system of indistinct, even pre-national mere system where you have all these different scattered people living together under the umbrella of a Russian people that has also ceased to be a classical nation, but has become something else. Whereas countries such as Serbia, such as Bulgaria, for example, to quote, to cite two Orthodox nations, Greece also, have chosen the pattern of the nation state, have chosen the pattern of a very strong national identity that does not want to be solved or to be dissolved in one large unity. Already after 1945, Yugoslavia has refused to become one part of this huge Soviet sphere of influence, but has preferred its own way. So that shows how Serbia and Bulgaria and many other states also in this transitional region are not classical parts of the Russian civilization, but feel, of course, also a bit different from the essentially Roman Catholic dominated West. So this is, I think, the problem in brackets of all peripheral parts of a huge civilization, that we have this periphery like parts also of southern Spain, of southern Italy. You could have a lot of debate to what extent the south of Italy is truly European, even though it speaks Italian, obviously, and is Catholic, or if it's already part of an Oriental civilization, because South Italy and Sicily have been Muslim and Oriental for such a long time, whereas the north of Italy obviously is one of the most vibrant and dynamic parts of the European civilization. So it's not only necessarily a question of religion. It is typical for the periphery that we can have these shifting allegiances, that we have nations that are ambivalent, like I myself, for example, as a bilingual German and French speaking person, I would also have huge difficulties in saying, am I the one or am I the other? Do I belong to the German sphere or to the French sphere? And ultimately, I can't really say. So I see that, of course, for regions on the periphery of this civilizational pattern, there is a problem, and there can never be a proper and very neat solution. So I'm sorry if from a certain point of view this is not a clear-cut answer, and I think my inability to really give a clear-cut answer to that is due on the one hand also to the fact that I'm not at all a specialist in this region, but also I believe it has to do with the ambivalence of these kind of peripheral region. When I speak, by the way, of peripheral, this is not meant to be an insult. I think that the periphery, in many respects, is often even more interesting in many points than the center. That is perhaps a bit boringly easy to define, whereas the periphery is much more complex and perhaps also much more interesting. So I couldn't say. The only thing that I can say is that I would sincerely hope rather to have you with us, if I can say you and us, than outside, and that I believe that your entire history and your entire wish for national independence and national identity is somehow a proof of a deep Western feeling that is probably very different from the classical Russian feeling, but that would at least be Spengler's argument, and I think it would not be that wrong.
On se najprej prvo izvinio što možda nije najkompetentnija osoba za to da kaže, rekao je da je ekstremno teško pitanje, dakle, za koje on i na kraju to ponovio, nije ekspert i ne može da da tačan odgovor. Uglavnom je, kad je govorio o pitanju, recimo, Srbije i Bugarske, pitanje našeg identiteta, naravno, najpre je istakao to da sam taj narod treba da definiše kako vidi svoj identitet, šta hoće i gde pripada i kojoj, dakle, i civilizacijskoj tradiciji i nasleđu i u kojoj budućnosti pripada i vidi sebe. I onda je, pokazujući iz istorije, na primjer, rusku specifičnost, da Rusija prosto je imperija po definiciji, što često i od Rusa čujemo, dakle, da Rusija nikad sebe nije mogla da definiše kao nacionalnu državu. Dakle, Rusija je prosto samom veličinom, svojom civilizacijom, nejasnim granicama, širinom integracije različitih kultura, religije, u krajnjem slučaju imperija po definiciji. A da, recimo, Srbija i Bugarska su u moderno vreme definisale sebe kao izrazito snažne nacionalne države nacije, dakle suverene, koje vrlo vode računa o tom nacionalnom identitetu jasno definisanom kao osnovi svog egzistiranja, i to je ono što ih odvaja, recimo, od ruske civilizacije, odnosno ruske imperijalne percepcije, i možda na neki način više približava drugim evropskim državama nacija. Opet to, s druge strane, nije vezano za ono što je centar te zapadne civilizacije, a to je tradicija rimske imperije i tako dalje. Dakle, i pomenuo je da je to, recimo, pitanje vrlo složeno identiteta na periferiji. Opet govoreći o tome da ne misli da je periferija, kad govori o raznim periferijama Evrope, nešto što je uredljivo, šta više. Mislim da su to identitetski daleko zanimljivija pitanja, ali daleko složenija. I dao je komparativne primere, recimo, juga Italije, Sicilija, Napoli i tako dalje, ili Andaluzije, dakle, juga Španije, u kome vi jasno vidite jedan potpuno drugačiji, složeniji identitet, kulturološki, artistički, na svaki drugi način, jer je tu, recimo, bio vekovima prisutan islam i ostavio svoje vrlo važne tragove. I dan danas, dakle, ogromna razlika između Sicilije i Lombardije, dakle, koja je potpuno civilizacijski drugačija, iako je to ista država, isti na neki način nacija danas, ali suštinski su to vrlo različite kulture. U tom smislu prosto i naša država, dakle i Balkan generalno, sa opet specifičnim nasleđem Orijenta, u tom nekom širem smislu. Orijent je, opet ne zaboravimo, Vizantija ili Istočno-Rimsko carstvo, jer Orijent po definiciji bio, što vidimo i kroz ljudi zaboravljaju da Orijent nisu ovdje Turci, dakle, konačno samo hrišćanstvo izvorne, kako ste ga mi prihvatili, je orijentalna religija, je opet nešto što je vrlo specifično i u nekom smislu možda rađe jedan poseban identitet ovde, koji je negde između svih tih svetova. I da ponovim na kraju, sam je rekao, nije ekspert za to i vrlo je teško pitanje identiteta i u kom smislu ko pripada gde danas. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Vielen Dank. Hvala vam svima, ostali smo baš podosta i hvala vam za dolazak i za sjajna pitanja i komentare i pre svega naravno hvala domaćinima i jednoj i drugoj instituciji, da ponovim, jako mi je drago da su i naše kolege iz Centra za društvene i političke istraživanja i nadamo se, ili da kažem na modernom evropskom jeziku inšara, da ćemo se viđati i družiti, kako je David rekao, da se malo našalimo Thank you very much, and with this we are finishing tonight's Alhamdulillah.
Great pleasure.